In 1868, at the Washita, an officer and 20 soldiers silently disappeared. Their commander did not even search for them. 19 days later, the place where they were found turned into one of the darkest scenes the American military has kept hidden to this day. The history of the American West is written in blood, revenge, and unspeakable brutality just as much as it is in tales of courage and exploration. However, there are some events that go beyond a mere battle or skirmish. These events point to the darkest corners of human nature and show how ruthless the struggle for survival can become for both sides. The story of Major Joel H. Elliott is exactly like this. He and the small detachment under his command did not merely lose their lives in the endless, freezing winter plains of America. They also became the center of one of the most controversial, horrifying, and highly debated events in American military history. To fully grasp the truth behind the incident, we must understand the chain of events that led up to that freezing November morning, the spirit of the era, and the desperation that gripped both sides. After the American Civil War ended, the nation's attention rapidly shifted west toward the Great Plains. White settlers, railroad companies, and gold prospectors were flooding into the territories of indigenous peoples who had lived on these lands for centuries. For nomadic tribes like the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Comanche, and Kiowa, this meant not only the loss of their land, but also the destruction of their way of life, their culture, and their very existence. Buffalo herds were hunted and slaughtered. Winter food sources were depleted, and old treaties were broken one after another. These violations inevitably led to violent clashes. Native warriors would attack settlements, stagecoaches, and military patrols using hit-and-run tactics, then vanish into the vast landscape. For the American Army, this situation was a nightmare. Traditional warfare tactics were completely ineffective against these highly mobile warriors who knew the massive plains like the back of their hands. It was exactly at this point that General Philip Sheridan, one of the ruthless heroes of the Civil War, stepped in. Sheridan realized that it was impossible to defeat Native Americans who rode across the plains in the summer, choosing when to fight and when to retreat. His strategy was far more cold-blooded, calculated, and merciless: the winter campaign. During the winter months, the native tribes largely lost their mobility, could not feed their horses, and were forced to establish winter camps in sheltered river valleys. Sheridan planned to send his army upon them in these freezing winter conditions, striking them at their most vulnerable and unprepared moment, alongside their families and all their winter provisions. This was a strategy of total war aimed at breaking the resistance not just of the warriors, but of the tribes as a whole. The man chosen to execute this brutal plan was Sheridan's most trusted, ambitious, brave, yet equally arrogant and reckless commander, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Custer was at the head of the 7th Cavalry Regiment and desperately needed a victory to regain his tarnished reputation. Among the officers under his command, one stood out as young, talented, and at least as ambitious as Custer, Major Joel Elliott. Elliott was an officer who had shown great merit during the Civil War and was known for his bravery. After the war, he had joined the regular army and risen quickly. However, in the military structure of that era, the only way for an officer to make a leap in his career, make a name for himself, and receive a prestigious brevet, field promotion, was to demonstrate extraordinary heroism or courage on the battlefield. Elliott was looking for this opportunity. He was confident in his abilities and did not want to remain in Custer's shadow. The Washita campaign was the great chance he had been waiting for. He wanted to prove himself and write his name in the history books. Yet he was unaware of the horrifying end this ambition would drag him toward. In late November 1868, the 7th Cavalry Regiment departed from Camp Supply and moved south. The conditions were harsh enough to test the limits of human endurance. The snow depth exceeded knee-high in places, and the freezing wind pierced the very marrow of the soldiers and horses. The thermometers were far below zero. Many soldiers narrowly escaped frostbite, and the horses were exhausted. But Custer was tracking like a hunting dog. The Osage Indian scouts had found fresh horse tracks. These tracks led them directly to the valley of the Washita River, to the southern Cheyenne camp led by Black Kettle. The tragic part was that Black Kettle was actually a peace chief. He was a leader who had survived the horrific massacre at Sand Creek years ago and had repeatedly tried to make peace with the American government. However, his camp also contained young and rebellious dog soldier warriors who had been attacking white settlements. To Custer, it did not matter whose camp it was or whether it was peaceful. He only saw a target to be destroyed and a victory to be won. On the night of November 26th, Custer and his men silently surrounded the camp in the freezing cold. The horses' hooves were wrapped in cloth so their footsteps wouldn't be heard, and the soldiers were forbidden to speak, smoke, or even light a fire. For hours, lying in the snow in temperatures reaching -20 degrees, they waited for dawn to break. This wait had stretched the soldiers' nerves to the breaking point. The cold, the fear, and the anticipation of impending violence made the deadly silence over the valley even heavier. Major Elliott commanded the left flank of the regiment. His mission was to sneak to the rear of the camp when the attack began and cut off the escape routes. We will never know what passed through his mind as he waited in the freezing darkness that night. Perhaps he dreamed of the approaching victory, perhaps the promotion he would receive, or perhaps simply of getting warm. But one thing is certain, Elliott was determined to emerge from this battle as a hero. On the morning of November the 27th, 1868, as the first light fell upon the snowy valley, Custer gave the order to attack. The regimental band began to play Garryowen, Custer's favorite Irish tune. The silence of that freezing morning was suddenly shattered by the screams of hundreds of cavalrymen, the neighing of horses, and the crack of rifles. The 7th Cavalry charged into the camp from all sides. The sleeping camp literally woke up to hell. Women, children, and the elderly bolted from their teepees in panic, plunging half-naked into the freezing waters of the river in an attempt to hide in the trees on the opposite bank. The Cheyenne warriors rapidly gathered themselves and mounted a fight to the death to buy time for their families to escape. Chief Black Kettle and his wife were shot and killed right in the middle of the river while trying to flee on their horses. Massacre and chaos spread to every corner of the valley. Gunfire, screams, smoke, and kicked-up snow dust had created a chaotic blizzard on the battlefield where one could barely see anything. Right in the middle of this unbelievable chaos, Major Joel Elliott noticed a group of Cheyennes fleeing downstream toward the narrowing part of the valley. His ambition and sense of duty had overshadowed his composure. He wanted to catch the fugitives and give them no quarter. He called out to the soldiers near him. There were a total of 17 or 18 men. While mounted on his horse, Elliott shouted those famous words that would go down in American military history and seal his fate. "Here goes for a brevet or a coffin." This was the picture of a moment when an officer staked his entire career and life on a single roll of the dice. He spurred his horse and, along with his men, galloped full tilt into the thickening fog and blowing snow. As Elliott and his detachment moved away from the main battlefield, the surrounding sounds gradually began to muffle. The bends of the river and the tall brush quickly hid them from view. Custer was so busy taking control of the camp, gathering prisoners, and slaughtering hundreds of captured native horses that he did not fully realize or care that his second-in-command had separated from the unit and disappeared toward the horizon. Later in the battle, heavy gunfire was heard from downstream, the direction Elliott had gone. Some officers warned Custer that Elliott might be in trouble and that help should be sent. But Custer did not want to risk his position. Furthermore, the scouts had brought chilling news. Along the Washita River, Black Kettle's camp was not alone. Further downstream lay massive winter camps belonging to the Arapaho, Kiowa, and other Cheyenne tribes housing thousands of warriors. The snowy valley that Elliott had recklessly plunged into was actually like a funnel leading straight into the nest of thousands of angry native warriors. Hearing the gunfire, warriors from the neighboring camps had quickly armed themselves and begun rushing up the valley. Blinded by ambition, Elliott thought he was only chasing a handful of fleeing people, but he was actually galloping toward his own funeral. The situation in the main area of the battlefield was growing increasingly tense. More and more native warriors began to appear on the hills, and the circle around Custer was tightening. Custer had to make a strategic decision. He needed to retreat quickly for his regiment to survive. As the sun slowly set and the freezing darkness settled back over the valley, Custer gave the order to withdraw. But what about Major Elliott and his men? 17 soldiers and a young, ambitious major. There was no trace of them. They had neither returned nor had any word been received from them. Custer made no serious attempt to search for them. In order to save his own troops, he abandoned his second in command and 17 soldiers to their fate in the heart of that freezing and dark valley. As the 7th Cavalry departed to the accompaniment of victory marches, they left behind a burning camp, hundreds of dead horses, and captured women and children. But what they truly left behind was an unechoed secret in the darkness. Understanding the psychology behind Elliott's recklessly bold decision reveals not only the military ambitions of the era, but also human decision-making mechanisms in times of crisis. He was not a simple soldier. He was educated, disciplined, but a young man who had become addicted to that unique adrenaline brought on by the battlefield. That morning at Washita, amidst the chaotic atmosphere created by exploding guns, burning teepees, and fleeing people, he did not act like a cold-blooded strategist, but rather like a predator that had caught the scent of its prey. Perhaps the desire to get into Custer's good graces had blinded him. Working under a figure like Custer was a crushing experience for many officers, as Custer had a character that loved to draw all the spotlight to himself, claiming success and not hesitating to blame failures on his subordinates. As Elliott rode his horse into that snowy valley, he likely thought he was advancing toward the lead role in his own story. He was going to create his own legend. However, the geography of the Washita Valley was cruel and deceptive. The deep ravines, thick thickets, and tall grass, though looking innocent under the white blanket of winter, offered perfect ambush spots. As Elliott and his 17 men advanced into that whiteness, they broke away from the noise, safety, and support of the main unit. As the soldiers forced their horses through the snow, their breath vaporized in the cold air, and nothing could be heard but the muffled sound of horses crushing the snow, apart from the clatter of their sabers and gear. The small Cheyenne group they were chasing was actually drawing them slowly into a deadly trap, a natural snare. The Indian warriors knew every inch, every hollow, every hill of the terrain. For them, these lands were not just a battlefield, but their home. And there could be nothing as dangerous as enraged warriors defending their homes, whose families had just been slaughtered. The faint gunfire Custer heard back at the main command post were actually the echoes of a short, violent, and absolutely desperate end. Captain Frederick Benteen, one of the officers, would never forgive Custer for this in the years to come, taking every opportunity to accuse him of being a commander who abandoned his own men to die. Benteen was at the forefront of those who told Custer they should look for Elliott when the gunshots were heard. But Custer, upon seeing the thousands of native warriors gathering around the camp, had decided that risking the troops he had left would be suicide. He made one of those ruthless decisions a commander must make on the battlefield, sacrificing the few to save the many. But this decision sowed a deep seed of doubt and hostility within the 7th Cavalry that would not heal for years, and would even show its effects years later at the Little Bighorn. That evening, as the 7th Cavalry began its journey back, a heavy, whispering silence prevailed among the soldiers. There was no euphoria of a victorious unit. Everyone was thinking about the fate of the 18 men they had left behind. When night fell and the freezing wind began to lick the valley again, the waters of the Washita River continued to flow mixed with blood. Elliott and his men were now simply casualties. However, no one could have guessed that the natives approached them not merely with anger, but with a much deeper, symbolic, and ritualistic hatred. The bodies hidden beneath that freezing snow concealed a reality that would freeze a person's blood, far beyond the legends of the Wild West. Their bodies had become not the victims of a battle, but the canvas for a bloody, horrifying message meant for an entire nation, the American Army, and all white settlers. This truth would wait silently in the dark until the snows melted and search parties stepped into that cursed valley. As the 7th Cavalry retreated toward Camp Supply through the freezing darkness and relentless wind, a weight fell upon the soldiers' shoulders that was not just physical exhaustion, but an indescribable remorse. The unwritten but blood-sealed, most sacred rule of an American cavalry regiment was that no soldier is left behind. Dead or alive, a soldier's body could not be abandoned on the battlefield. Yet Custer had turned his back and left exactly 18 of his men, moreover, one of the brightest officers of his regiment, in the middle of the unknown. As the horses crushed the snow in the pitch-black night, the same horrifying question echoed in the mind of every soldier, commissioned or not. What if it was me trapped in that valley? Custer might have saved the bulk of his regiment, but as he left the Washita Valley that night, he had also left the soul of the 7th Cavalry and the soldiers' absolute trust in their commander buried beneath that snow. For Captain Frederick Benteen in particular, this situation was an unacceptable betrayal. Benteen was an experienced, proud officer, deeply devoted to his men. On that chaotic afternoon at Washita, he was the one who warned Custer to look for Elliott, but his warnings were ignored. Throughout the return journey, Benteen tried to suppress the deep anger growing inside him, wrapping around his soul like a poisonous vine against Custer. How could one respect a commander who abandoned his own men to die, while their gunshots, which could be considered cries for help, were being heard? This anger of Benteen's would be the first spark of a deadly polarization that would damage Custer's reputation in the coming months, last for years within the regiment, and stretch all the way to the Little Bighorn disaster. But for that moment, surviving the freezing cold and reaching the headquarters was more important than anything else. Custer, on the other hand, seemed to be living in a completely different reality. When he reached Camp Supply, he acted not like a commander mourning his 18 lost men, but like a triumphant general who had achieved his long-awaited victory. The report he presented to General Philip Sheridan was literally a public relations masterpiece. In his report, Custer portrayed the Washita campaign as a massive military success, claiming that hundreds of native warriors had been killed, a giant winter camp completely destroyed, and a fatal blow dealt to the native resistance in the region. He barely mentioned the deaths of women, children, and the elderly, framing the event entirely as a legitimate and brilliant military victory. However, the darkest point of the report was the section mentioning Major Elliott and his men. Custer noted that they were missing, but provided absolutely no satisfactory explanation as to why he had made no effort to search for them. When the news reached the East Washington and the newspapers of major cities, public opinion split in two. On one side were those who applauded Custer as the great hero of the Indian Wars, seeing him as a knight civilizing the wild nature of the West. On the other side, particularly human rights advocates and intellectual circles in the East, loudly proclaimed that what happened at Washita was not a battle, but a massacre. Yet the real storm within the army broke out not over the ethical dimensions of the victory, but over the abandoned soldiers. Benteen could not stay silent. He wrote an anonymous letter to the St. Louis Democrat newspaper, harshly criticizing Custer's actions at Washita and accusing him of cowardly leaving his own soldiers to die. When the letter was published, it had a bombshell effect within the army. Custer went mad with rage, gathered his regiment, and shouted that he would personally punish the coward who wrote the letter. Benteen stepped forward, putting his hand on his gun, and stated that he had written the letter. The silence at that moment was the most concrete evidence of the incurable crack inside the 7th Cavalry. In the midst of all these internal conflicts and the growing scandal, General Sheridan had to prevent the situation from spinning out of control. Sheridan was the architect of the ruthless winter strategy and did not want Custer's victory to be overshadowed. However, there was a massive, dark void. The bodies of Major Elliott and the 17 soldiers still had not been found. Not knowing their fate was both a source of shame for the army and caused rumors to snowball. Some whispered that they had been taken prisoner and tortured, others that they had frozen to death under the snow. Sheridan decided that the truth must come to light and that the might of the army had to be shown to that valley once again, this time much more overwhelmingly. They would return not only to retrieve the dead, but also to prove to the native tribes that the Washita Valley was no longer their safe haven. In early December, about 2 weeks after the Washita raid, a much larger and better equipped army departed Camp Supply and moved south again toward that cursed valley. This time, General Sheridan himself was at the head of the army, and Custer was right beside him. The weather conditions were far more brutal than the first time. Blizzards reduced visibility to zero, and the freezing wind cut the soldiers' faces like a knife. Supply wagons got stuck in the snow, and the march became incredibly slow and torturous. But Sheridan was determined. This was more of a show of force and an operation to unearth a dark secret rather than a search and rescue mission. A tense silence reigned among the soldiers. Those who had participated in the first battle were filled with the chilling anticipation of knowing what they would encounter. Those who had not were experiencing the anxiety of seeing with their own eyes how much of the horrifying stories whispered around the campfires were true. When the massive column of the army finally reached the valley of the Washita River, after days of grueling marching, the scene they encountered resembled a post-apocalyptic world. There was no trace of the valley's old, peaceful silence. Instead, the heavy, gloomy silence of death had descended. Although the snow had tried to cover everything with a white blanket, it could not hide the destruction wrought by man. When they descended to the area where Black Kettle's camp had been, there was a heavy, pungent smell in the air despite the freezing cold. The skeletons of burned teepees stuck out of the snow like black bones. Scattered broken pottery, shredded buffalo hides, and frozen pools of blood were the silent witnesses to the hell experienced here 2 weeks ago. But what made the scene truly horrifying were the massive, shapeless mounds a little further away. The carcasses of over 800 Cheyenne horses, slaughtered on Custer's orders, had formed giant, frozen mountains beneath the snow. Rigid limbs jutted out from the snow at bizarre, grotesque angles. The scale of this slaughter gave even Sheridan momentary pause. However, their purpose for coming here was not to see the condition of the horses or the burned camp. All eyes were turned downstream, toward the ominous direction where the river wound and narrowed, the direction where Elliott and his men had disappeared. Sheridan, Custer, and a select group of officers took the most experienced scouts with them and began to proceed slowly downstream. With every step, hearts beat faster and the grips on rifles tightened. It was almost impossible to find tracks from 2 weeks ago on the snow. The wind and fresh snowfalls had largely erased the marks of horse hooves and struggles. But the scouts knew the layout of the land well and how a chase might end. They proceeded by carefully examining the thick brush and small hills along the riverbank. After advancing for about 2 miles, one of the scouts suddenly stopped his horse and raised his hand in the air. The silence sharpened like a knife. The officers quickly rode their horses in that direction. The scout pointed to a gently rising hill surrounded by tall grass and small bushes, situated at a bend in the river. The flawless whiteness of the snow had given way to strange, irregular, and dark-colored shadows on the slopes of that hill. As the group approached the hill, the horses grew restless, snorting and trying to pull back. That genetic sense of danger the horses felt stemmed from a heavy stench of death mixing into the air. The details that slowly began to emerge on the snow were enough to take the soldiers' breath away. The first things they saw were empty bullet casings buried in the snow and pieces of shattered military equipment. Taking a few more steps, they noticed massive pools of blood, frozen and turned black on the snow. And then, in that small, narrow space stretching toward the summit of the hill, a line of bodies protruding from beneath the snow, frozen stiff, and having been subjected to unimaginable violence, began to reveal itself. This was not just a battlefield. This was a scene torn straight from hell, where savagery and superhuman rage were ruthlessly displayed. The soldiers froze on their horses at the sight, for the details they were about to face were horrific enough to haunt the dreams of even the most battle-hardened veterans. As the boots of the dismounting soldiers sank into the thick layer of snow, the only sound they heard around that ominous hill was the desolate howl of the freezing wind. General Philip Sheridan and Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer had completely lost those confident, stern commander expressions they had worn throughout the arduous march of the past few days. The soldiers in the search party noticed their hands involuntarily trembling as they gripped the cold stocks of their rifles, unable to tell whether this trembling came from the biting winter frost or from the indescribable scene awaiting them a few steps away. The tableau lying before them was far removed from the honor, rules, and order of traditional wars where armies clashed. This was a depiction of hell painted on the snow with the brushstrokes of primitive, uncontrolled, and relentless fury. The bodies of the 18 men lying on the ground, creating a blood-curdling contrast with the innocent, flawless whiteness of the snow, resembled marble statues turned completely stiff under the effect of sub-zero temperatures. Yet these statues had been completely stripped of their human form, turned into lumps of flesh, virtually kneaded with hatred and torn to pieces. From what the scouts could deduce from the chaotic tracks on the ground and the blackened empty casings stuck in the snow, what happened here that day was a short but incredibly fierce struggle for life and death. When Major Elliott and his men entered this narrow valley pursuing the small group they were chasing, they realized too late that they had fallen right into the middle of a deadly trap. Understanding they were surrounded, they executed the most basic and perhaps most desperate maneuver of cavalry tactics by dismounting and forming a small, tight defensive perimeter, shoulder to shoulder. The bullet casings on the ground proved that they had locked together to protect that circle until the very last moment, putting up a hopeless resistance until their ammunition ran out. But against hundreds, perhaps over 1,000 Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Kiowa warriors rushing in from neighboring camps, the survival chances of these 18 men were literally zero. When their bullets ran out, they had to face the massive tide of rage crashing over them in waves with their bare hands. The process that began when the gunfire completely ceased and the last soldier fell to the ground was not the end of the battle, but the beginning of the true psychological horror. In the heart of that freezing valley, a literally bloody ritual of savagery was performed upon those 18 defenseless bodies. The first soldiers brave enough to approach the corpses had incredible difficulty suppressing the burning nausea surging from their stomachs to their throats. Some of the experienced officers could not bear it and looked away, while some of the young privates fell to their knees, struggling to stop themselves from vomiting. Without exception, every soldier lying on the ground had been completely stripped bare despite the freezing cold. There was no trace of those familiar blue cavalry uniforms representing the army, their thick winter coats, or their boots. Their clothes, weapons, ammunition, and all the personal items in their pockets had been meticulously looted. However, what froze the blood of the search party was not the helpless nakedness of their fallen comrades on the snow. The truly shocking thing was the unimaginable, systematic, and savage mutilation inflicted upon these naked bodies. On every single corpse, there were enough arrows sticking out that they could easily be counted even from a distance. In the rib cages, backs, stomachs, and legs of some soldiers, 20 or even 30 arrows remained lodged simultaneously. It was blatantly clear that these arrows had not been shot to kill the men during the clash. The warriors had continued shooting arrows into their lifeless bodies to use them as pincushions long after these men were dead. It was nearly impossible to look at the soldiers' faces, for there were no faces left. Their skulls had been completely crushed by the relentless blows of heavy war clubs and native axes called tomahawks. Their noses, jaws, and eye sockets flattened, entirely erasing their human features. Most had their throats slashed with deep, wide, and brutal cuts stretching from ear to ear. But the torture, the hatred, and the urge to dismember the body did not stop there. The countless deep gashes seen on the bodies bore the marks not just of knife strikes swung in anger, but of a finely detailed, savage ritual. Many of the men had their fingers, hands, or feet chopped off with harsh axe blows, separated from their torsos, and randomly tossed onto the snow. Some corpses had their bellies slit wide open, their internal organs spilled out onto the freezing snow, and left just like that. This horrifying scene, which completely disregarded the honor of a soldier and the integrity of the human body, carried a much deeper, darker meaning than a mere death. And of course, the ultimate display of humiliating the enemy and proving victory in the Indian Wars, scalping, had been ruthlessly inflicted on every single soldier in its most severe form. In fact, not just one piece, but multiple pieces of skin had been flayed from the heads of some soldiers, leaving their crushed skulls almost entirely skinless, as a bloody pile of bones abandoned to the freezing cold. Among these shapeless, mutilated, bloody lumps of flesh frozen solid by the cold, finding Major Joel Elliott, one of the respected commanders of the unit, was not easy at all. The fact that the faces were unrecognizable and that none of them had any clothing to indicate rank or name-turned identification into outright agony. The soldiers were able to identify their commander with great difficulty based on some old scars on his body, his hair color, and his physique. When Elliott's body was identified, it was painfully clear that the savagery inflicted upon him was no different from that of the ordinary privates, and perhaps even heavier because he was recognized as an officer, a leader. Only 2 weeks ago, the end of that ambitious, brilliant young man burning with dreams of a field promotion, who rode his horse into the snow yelling, "Here goes for a brevet or a coffin," had turned into one of the most tragic and shocking scenes in American military history. With countless arrows in his body, a completely crushed skull, and deep gashes, Joel Elliott was no longer a hero to the officers standing there at that moment, but a symbol of a terrifying revenge that made one shudder, a cruel warning. It is unknown what Custer felt at that moment in the face of this disastrous end of his former subordinate, or what kind of reckoning he experienced with his own conscience while looking at this body that was too mangled to even look at its face. But his profound silence at that moment was the loudest scream echoing in the minds of the surrounding officers, especially Captain Benteen. But why? Why were they not content merely to kill these soldiers, but attacked a human body, a lump of flesh, with such superhuman, such demonic rage? Why was such a deliberate, savage example made out of Major Elliott and his men? To fully understand this, we must understand the West and dive deep into the world of the Native Americans and their psychology at that moment. In the ancient belief systems of many Native tribes, the quality of eternal life to be lived in the spirit world was strictly dependent on the condition of the physical body at the moment of death. It was believed that the more an enemy's body was mutilated, damaged, and crippled, the weaker, more disabled, and powerless their soul would be in the afterlife. An enemy whose eyes were gouged out could not see in the next world. An enemy whose legs or feet were cut off could not walk in the next world. A warrior whose hands were chopped off could not hold a weapon in the next world. Therefore, mutilating the enemy's body after death was not just the satisfaction of an earthly, momentary sense of revenge. It also meant severely punishing the enemy's soul in eternity, paralyzing it forever, and completely destroying it on the spiritual plane. This was the ultimate attack made upon the enemy's soul. However, spiritual beliefs or religious rituals were not the only reason behind this event at Washita. The main reason lay hidden in the nature of what happened that morning. What happened at Washita was not a battle on equal terms where two armies met in an open field. It was a raid in which sleeping people, the homes they took shelter in the middle of winter, women, the elderly, and children were ruthlessly massacred. The warriors who chased Elliott and his detachment surrounding them had witnessed with their own eyes just a few hours earlier how their own families, wives, and children were mercilessly gunned down by American cavalrymen, how their teepees were burned. The grief, despair, and boundless fury within them was on such a massive scale that at the first opportunity for revenge, they billed all that indescribable pain to these 18 soldiers. Elliott and his detachment were seen as representatives of the American army, the white man invading their lands, and that relentless, merciless destruction. Their bodies were turned into a bloody message board made of flesh and blood, left in the middle of that freezing valley. The message delivered was a very clear threat aimed at General Sheridan, Custer, and all of Washington. If you enter our homes in the winter months when we are most vulnerable and massacre our women and children, this is exactly what will be done to you when we encounter you. We will not only kill you, we will tear your body to pieces and erase you from both the earth and the spirit world. This was the most terrifying, most savage scream of a people fighting for survival, directed at the invaders. This horrifying scene also laid bare the psychological cost of the ruthless strategy General Sheridan called the Winter Campaign on American soldiers. Following the orders of their commanders, the soldiers began pulling the frozen bodies from the snow one by one, gathering the scattered, severed limbs, and wrapping them in thick wool blankets. Due to the freezing cold, the corpses had practically turned to stone. Thus, even carrying them properly and placing them on the backs of horses or in supply wagons was a physical torment in itself. The fact that each soldier had direct contact with the mutilated, unrecognizable, cold body of his own comrade in arms was carving itself into the army as a deep trauma that perhaps would not be erased for years. Captain Frederick Benteen, while personally directing the collection of his men's bodies, pressed his lips together so tightly they bled, not even feeling the need to hide the pure, burning fire of anger in his eyes from Custer. Benteen did not view this scene as a twist of fate or a natural consequence of war. He saw it directly as the direct result of Custer's arrogance, selfishness, and tendency to expend his men for the sake of glory and fame. Every body part wrapped in a blanket and collected on that bloody hill cracked a little more that invisible but deep fault line inside the 7th Cavalry Regiment, shattered loyalty, and step by step, stone by stone, paved the dark road leading to the great ultimate disaster that would take place years later on the hills of the Little Bighorn. Collecting those mutilated bodies from the freezing snow was not just physical agony, it was soul-crushing torture. As the soldiers of the 7th Cavalry Regiment wrapped the unrecognizable lumps of flesh of their comrades, with whom they had ridden side by side just a few weeks ago, shared the same campfire, and joked, into wool blankets, the deadly silence in that valley was broken only by the muffled breaths of young privates trying to suppress their sobs. The soldiers had great difficulty placing the bodies, which had turned practically to stone under the merciless freezing effect of winter, into proper positions. Trying to match severed limbs to main torsos, covering smashed skulls, was one of the heaviest psychological traumas a person could endure. The body of Major Joel Elliott, along with the bodies of the other 17 soldiers, was the heaviest part of this terrifying process. That ambitious, bright-futured commander, burning with dreams of a field promotion, was now nothing but a shapeless, flayed warning sign, radiating horror all around. The soldiers knew very well right then, on that bloody snow, that they would never be able to erase this horrifying scene from their minds for the rest of their lives. The burial process of the bodies turned into another torment, where nature also took a stand against the army. In that freezing cold of December, the soil of the Washita Valley had literally hardened like iron. As the soldiers struck the earth with their picks and shovels, the tools broke and bounced back. The ground seemingly did not want to accept the victims of this savagery. After a long, exhausting, and frustrating effort, a mass grave could be dug for the 17 nameless, mutilated privates. They were laid to rest on that cursed hill, exactly where they were slaughtered. However, Major Elliott's situation was different. As an officer, the hierarchical structure of the army functioned even in death. His ruthlessly dismembered, arrow-riddled body was specially placed in a supply wagon. Custer was going to take his former second-in-command back to Fort Arbuckle to be buried with a military ceremony. Perhaps this was a strategic move made by Custer to ease that horrific guilty conscience, or at least to maintain his image to the outside world as a commander who honors his hero officer. But everyone knew that what lay inside that wagon was less of a hero and more the bloody invoice of Custer's arrogance. Throughout this entire process, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's demeanor has always been a dark subject of study for historians, military analysts, and psychologists. Standing by those frozen graves, Custer did not show the slightest sign of remorse, devastation, or admission of a mistake. He had retreated into the most classic defense mechanism of a narcissistic commander, emotionally completely detached, cold-blooded, and self-righteous. In the reality he created in his own mind, Washita was a great victory, and every war had inevitable casualties. He believed that Elliott had plunged into that valley on his own, recklessly, disobeying orders, and architecting his own end. Perhaps he was right. Elliott truly had been the victim of his ambition that day. However, the fact that the most fundamental duty of a commander, the rule of leaving no men behind, had been broken rendered this cold defense of Custer's completely invalid in the eyes of the soldiers. As Custer looked at the corpses, he saw only the ruthless nature of war. The soldiers, however, saw in those corpses proof of how easily their commander could sacrifice them for his own glory and fame. The deep, unhealable chasm among the officer cadre of the 7th Cavalry Regiment took its final form right there by that frozen grave in that heavy silence. For Captain Frederick Benteen, that moment was when his distrust of Custer turned into pure, unadulterated hatred. As Benteen looked at the mutilated faces of the men, he cursed Custer's arrogance. In Benteen's eyes, there was no honor left in the victory at Washita. From that moment on, the 7th Cavalry ceased to be a unit united behind a single commander. The regiment was split into two sharp camps, those who worshipped Custer and those who hated Custer. This dissenting group, led by Benteen, would question every order of their commander and look for a selfish motivation behind every decision he made. This poisonous atmosphere would spread through the regiment like a cancer for years, and would ultimately be one of the bitterest explanations as to why Benteen acted so reluctantly and slowly to come to the rescue when Custer was surrounded by thousands of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors on the hills of the Little Bighorn. Those seeds of doubt sown at Washita would turn into a massive, bloody sycamore tree years later. After the bodies were collected and farewell was bid to that desolate valley, when the army began its journey back, no one opened their mouths except for the howling of the wind. However, this silence was not just a silence of mourning. In the minds of the soldiers echoed that savage example the native tribes had made of Major Elliott and his men. The Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors had wanted to send a very clear message to the white man by tearing those bodies to pieces. This message was, "If you enter our lands, if you touch our families, we will not only kill you, we will destroy your body, your honor, and your soul." The natives had hoped that this unbelievable display of violence would strike deadly fear into the hearts of American soldiers, keep them away from these lands, and at least cause them to collapse psychologically. This was the most savage law of nature: destroy your enemy in such a horrifying way that no one would ever dare face you again. However, there was a very critical, deadly mistake the natives had not accounted for. The power facing them moved not by the laws of nature, but by the revenge machines of the industrial age. When the details of this savagery reached the East, Washington, and the glittering newspapers of New York, the shockwave in public opinion did not lead to a retreat or a demand for peace, as the natives had hoped. On the contrary, it caused an unprecedented explosion of anger. The human rights advocates and intellectuals in the East, who initially judged Custer's attack on a sleeping camp and the killing of women and children as a massacre, fell into a deep silence when the details of the horrifying mutilation of Major Elliott and his 17 soldiers were splashed across the newspapers. The stories of soldiers riddled with arrows, faces smashed, and skin flayed fueled that primal fear of the savage Indian in the subconscious of the American public. What was now being debated was no longer Custer's brutal tactics, but the question of how these wild animals would be stopped. The bloody example created by the natives to serve as a deterrent had ironically become the greatest tool of justification for the total war that would bring about their own end. For ruthless, realist commanders like General Philip Sheridan and Army Chief of Staff William Tecumseh Sherman, Major Elliott's mutilated body was practically a political godsend. By presenting this savagery to Congress and the American public, Sheridan argued how justified and necessary his winter campaign was. "Look," Sheridan was saying between the lines, "the enemy facing us is not an honorable army with rules. They are merciless savages who reduce our soldiers to this state at the slightest opportunity. You cannot make treaties with them. You cannot talk to them. The only solution is to destroy them wherever we find them, in their camps, along with their families." This dark propaganda carried out over the corpses of Elliott and his men had given the American army the authority to commit any kind of brutality it desired on the plains, along with the full support of public opinion. The natives had painted a picture of horror to instill fear, but that picture turned into a legal framework hung over the massacres committed by the American army. This terrifying example also caused a dark, irreversible threshold to be crossed in the individual psychology of American cavalrymen. No soldier who saw those corpses at Washita or listened to the details in whispers around campfires believed any more that fighting on those lands was subject to the old rules. A brand new, blood-curdling, unwritten rule began to spread rapidly among the soldiers: never be taken alive. If your horse was shot, your ammunition ran out, and you were surrounded, surrender was not an option, because the end result of surrender was sharing the fate of Elliott and his men on that snow. The soldiers started saving the last bullet in their revolvers, not for the enemy, but for their own temples. The nature of the war had changed. This was no longer a struggle for land or a political conflict. This was a war of absolute annihilation where both sides stopped seeing each other as human, where mercy, pity, and honor completely vanished. The horrifying legacy left beneath the snow on the banks of the Washita River sealed the fate not only of the dead, but also of the living. Major Joel Elliott's ambition had dragged him into that narrow valley. The fires of vengeance of the Cheyenne warriors had torn him apart, and all this savagery had turned into a catalyst accelerating the bloody history of the American West. What happened on that freezing November morning had long ceased to be a simple skirmish, evolving into a massive psychological threshold where a nation confronted its own internal darkness, ambitions, and most primitive fears. But the story was not over yet, for the secrets whispered by the wind in that valley, Custer's arrogance, and the desperate resistance of the Native Americans were just the harbingers of a much larger, bloodier reckoning of that great storm that would break at Little Bighorn years later. The echoes of Washita had long since crossed the borders of that freezing valley, becoming a turning point that reshaped the fate of the entire American West. There was no longer a treaty table or goodwill ambassadors. General Sheridan's winter campaign strategy had, in a way, gained its own bloody legitimacy with the sacrifice of Major Elliott and his men. For the Army, there was no turning back anymore. The cavalry units had turned into killing machines, much like the ruthless hunters of legends, focused on scouring the plains and finding and destroying Native American camps, even in the harshest winter conditions. Elliott's mutilated body had transformed into an oath of vengeance in the mind of every soldier, and an excuse for ruthlessness in the Army's command echelon. There was no room for mercy in this new doctrine of war, for they had learned in the most bitter way on that bloody snow that the opposing side had no mercy either. On the front of the native tribes, the situation was a spiral of utter despair and radicalization. The shooting and killing of Chief Black Kettle in front of his own teepee at Washita alongside his wife actually meant the complete silencing of the pro-peace voices within the tribes. Black Kettle was an old and tired leader who, despite surviving the Sand Creek Massacre, was still looking for ways to live together with the white man and trying to stay true to treaties. His peace pipe had been shattered by the bullets of Custer's soldiers. This death proved the following indisputable truth to the young, angry warriors in the Cheyenne and Arapaho camps, especially the legendary rebellious group known as the Dog Soldiers. Peace cannot be made with the white man. Surrendering, trusting treaties, and sleeping by the river simply means waiting for your family to be massacred. This radical awakening pushed the resistance of the natives to a much more deadly, uncompromising level. For the natives, the meaning of Washita was a trauma far deeper than a military loss. When their teepees were burned, it wasn't just their shelters that were destroyed. Their sacred objects passed down from generation to generation, ceremonial clothing, winter provisions, and the thousands of horses that ensured their survival were annihilated in that valley. For a Plains Indian, a horse was not just a beast of burden, it was power, wealth, mobility, and hunting skill. Custer's order to ruthlessly gun down hundreds of horses was actually a bullet fired into the soul of the natives. A warrior who lost his horse was like an eagle with its wings torn off. This immense loss had also upended the social hierarchy and traditional roles among the tribes. The survivors were forced to take refuge in the camps of other tribes by walking in the freezing winter months, struggling with hunger and disease. This desperation was the sole fuel stoking the fire of vengeance within them. That terrifying ritual they performed on Major Elliott and his men was an expression of this indescribable loss, of that deep despair. At their first opportunity, within the framework of their own belief system, they had exacted the heaviest revenge on the army of the white man who stole their lands and their future. However, this revenge would not be enough to protect them from the approaching storm. At the same time, realizing that they were not safe even in the winter months was the heaviest blow struck at the heart of their nomadic lifestyle. These people, who had spent the freezing cold of winter for thousands of years hiding in river valleys and eating the meat of the bison they hunted, were now afraid even to leave footprints on the snow. Sheridan was reading this psychological collapse very well. He had completely destroyed the safe haven in the enemy's mind and had no intention of stopping. Right after Washita, Despite those terrifying winter conditions, he continued to drive his soldiers further south, toward the Texas borders. The goal was to confront the Kiowa and Comanche tribes with the same terror, condemning them either to surrender or starve to death. American cavalrymen emerged like ghosts from blizzards, burning villages, slaughtering horse herds, and leaving tribes without food or shelter in the middle of freezing plains. This was not a war in the traditional sense, but a strategy of rendering a habitat completely uninhabitable, in modern terms, a kind of ethnic cleansing operation. For the Native Americans, this meant not just a military defeat, but the severing of their thousands of years of existence and the spiritual and physical bond they had formed with those vast plains. They had nowhere left to go, no valleys to take shelter in. Hunger, cold, and the endless fear created by those relentless soldiers in blue uniforms chasing them had slowly begun to break the backbone of the resistance. When we return to the internal dynamics of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, we see that a similar, perhaps even more insidious version of this brutal war outside was being experienced in the officer tents. Custer might have been a hero in the eyes of the press and Sheridan, but his reputation among his own men had taken an incurable wound on that bloody hill. For Captain Frederick Benteen and the officers who thought like him, Custer was a dangerous showman who could sacrifice his men for glory and fame, and who never admitted his own mistakes. This division within the regiment was not a simple disagreement. In an environment where meals were shared every day, patrols were conducted, and battles were fought back to back, it meant a deadly lack of trust. That unsigned letter written by Benteen and the subsequent confrontation had left a deep scratch on Custer's ego. Custer began to surround himself only with young officers who offered him absolute obedience, did not criticize him, and believed in his legend. By placing family members, his brother Tom Custer, and his brother-in-law in the command structure, he essentially established his own royal court. This meant a closed-off command structure intolerant of criticism, where loyalty took the place of merit. Major Elliott's vacated seat could be filled, but the ghost of those 18 men continued to hang over the regiment like a dark cloud ready to burst at any moment. Custer's introverted and selfish command style also showed how obsessed he was with building his own legend. In articles he wrote himself, and in his later published book, My Life on the Plains, he would narrate Washita as an epic of heroism, bringing his own brilliance and courage to the forefront, while presenting the dark end of Elliott and his men as a footnote, an inevitable misfortune. In fact, in some of his lines, he would attempt to cover up his own command weakness by placing the blame entirely on Elliott's inexperience and impulsiveness. But ink could not wash away that blood on the snow. The experienced wolves within the army like Benteen could very clearly see the arrogance and cowardice behind those lines. The 7th Cavalry was now like a two-headed snake, one head looking to Custer's endless quest for glory, the other head looking to Benteen's dark, grudge-filled reality. And inevitably, one day, these two heads would bite each other, poisoning the entire regiment. While all this was happening within the army, a completely different wind was blowing in the marble corridors of Washington. The approaching presidential elections and the looming presidency of Ulysses S. Grant carried the promise of opening a new page in Native American policies. Grant was a leader tired of the bloody days of the Civil War, wanting to govern the nation with a new vision he called the peace policy. According to this policy, natives would be civilized not by brute force, but with the help of Christian missionaries, educators, and honest bureaucrats, and would live by farming in designated areas called reservations. However, this idealistic vision was diametrically opposed to the brutal reality of the West. Commanders like Sheridan, Sherman, and Custer, serving on the plains, saw this peace policy simply as Eastern naivete, the daydreams of politicians making decisions at a desk without knowing the blood and dust in the field. To them, extending an olive branch to these people before the blood of those soldiers, whose faces were smashed and bodies riddled with arrows at Washita, had dried, meant not only betraying the army, but also inviting new massacres. The horrific death of Major Elliott had become the strongest political trump card in the hands of the army commanders. Whenever a peaceful solution was brought to the agenda, those bloody photographs and horrifying autopsy reports of Elliott and his men were laid on the table. This contrast was not merely of two different policies, but a picture of the dividedness of the American identity. While tales of civilization and peace were being told on one side, a dark, bloody, and uncompromising machine of destruction continued to operate on the other. While politicians in Washington signed peace declarations, soldiers on the frontiers sharpened their bayonets, and the natives hoarded ammunition to survive. This hypocritical atmosphere had created an unreliable, toxic ground for both sides. The native tribes had experienced very bitterly at Washita that they could become the victims of a new winter raid before the ink on the treaty text presented to them had even dried. No one believed the promises of the American government anymore. The rules of war had been rewritten with the arrows piercing Major Elliott's body, and these new rules had a single purpose: submit entirely or be destroyed. Washita was the place where a point of no return psychological boundary was crossed in America's process of conquering the West, and the dark wind that broke from that valley had slowly, step by step, begun to drag the entire country toward those bloody hills of the Little Bighorn. That freezing and bloody wind blowing in the Washita Valley was actually just the first breeze of that perfect storm that would break out on the hills of the Little Bighorn exactly 8 years later. Washita might have been recorded as a victory for the American Army and public, and the brutal effectiveness of winter campaigns might have been proven on paper with the death of Chief Black Kettle. However, within the 7th Cavalry Regiment itself, the ghost of those 18 mutilated bodies lying on that snowy hill had turned into a poison slowly gnawing at the regiment's soul. It was a historical fact that Major Joel Elliott had succumbed to his arrogance and ambition, preparing his own end. But what was truly unforgivable in the eyes of the soldiers was that his commander, George Armstrong Custer, had completely abandoned him to his fate in that darkness, in that despair. That most sacred, unwritten rule of the Army, that unshakable oath of brotherhood, had drowned in the freezing waters of Washita. Captain Frederick Benteen and the dissenting officers rallying around him obeyed Custer from that day on, only as a legal obligation, as their superior. Yet every time they looked into Custer's eyes, they actually saw the arrow-riddled, crushed, and dehumanized faces of their friends left beneath that snow. For a commander, losing the respect, faith, and trust of the experienced soldiers under his command is a far more deadly weakness than being left without a sword on the battlefield. And Custer had already made this fatal mistake, just because of his obsession with building his narcissistic legend flawlessly. As the years chased one another, the American government's policy of confining the Native Americans on the plains to reservations became increasingly harsh and uncompromising. Treaties were broken one by one, and gold prospectors flooded into the lands the natives considered most sacred, especially the Black Hills region, like a swarm of locusts. This insatiable desire for expansion was the final nail in the coffin of peaceful solutions. Uniting in a way unseen in their history, the Cheyenne and Sioux tribes formed a massive front of resistance around visionary leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. They were no longer the frightened and desperate small tribes hiding by riverbanks in the freezing cold of winter. There was a tremendous army of thousands of skilled warriors who had already risked death to defend their lands, their culture, and their existence. When the American Army launched a massive three-pronged campaign to disperse this great gathering in the hot June of 1876, that dark and ironic web of fate had also slowly begun to be woven. Custer and the internally rotted 7th Cavalry Regiment were on stage once again as the most important striking force of this campaign. When they approached the Little Bighorn Valley, Custer, just as he had done at Washita 8 years earlier, once again fell victim to his deadly arrogance. He completely underestimated the size, determination, and military genius of the enemy facing him. Even though his scouts told him there were thousands of warriors in the valley and that this was the largest Native American camp they had ever seen, he thought he was merely chasing fleeing prey. He didn't want to share the glory and fame with others. Instead of waiting for support units, he forced his soldiers on an exhausting night march and decided to split the 7th Cavalry into pieces to attack the camp from different directions. He divided the unit into 3, giving one column to Major Marcus Reno and another column to his old and irreconcilable enemy, Captain Frederick Benteen. He himself, along with the main striking force, would swing around the camp to deliver the decisive blow. But unlike Washita, this time facing him was not a sleeping, defenseless winter camp, but a fully equipped, angry, massive war machine swarming like a beehive. As Custer rode his horse toward the valley under that hot June sun, he was actually walking on his own 2 feet into the exact same trap Major Elliott had fallen into on that snowy day 8 years ago. When the battle began, Reno's troops were crushed under the natives' massive counterattack, forced to retreat, and took up a desperate defensive position on a hill. Custer, on the other hand, was completely surrounded at the other end of the valley by thousands of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. That was when one of the greatest breaking points in history occurred. When Custer realized the gravity of the situation, he desperately sent a messenger to the men he had always looked down upon and seen merely as subordinates up until that day. "Benteen, come on. Big village, be quick, bring packs." But when Benteen read this note, he did not spur his horse to a gallop to come to Custer's aid. On the contrary, he slowed his pace, merged with Reno's battered troops, and chose to wait on that hill. Historians have debated for over a century why Benteen did not go to Custer's aid that day. Was it a tactical decision? Was it fear? Or did he just want to save Reno's troops? But for anyone reading the psychology of the army and the past of those men, the real answer lies hidden in those 18 corpses left beneath the snow in the Washita Valley. As Benteen listened to the heavy gunfire coming from afar, there was very likely only a single image echoing in his mind: Major Elliott and his men. Would he now risk his own life and his unit for a commander who had knowingly abandoned his own men to die 8 years ago, turning a deaf ear to their screams? That seed of betrayal sown at Washita had borne its fruit on the hills of the Little Bighorn, with Benteen's cold-blooded inaction. Custer was reaping exactly what he had sown. As the gunfire behind the hill gradually ceased, the commander of the 7th Cavalry Regiment and the 210 men with him fought to their last bullet, just like Elliott's small detachment, and were wiped from the face of the earth without a single survivor. The scene that the search and rescue teams entering that battlefield after the fight encountered was like a grotesque copy of Washita. Custer's soldiers had also been completely stripped, mutilated, riddled with arrows, and rendered unrecognizable. As the Native American warriors dealt that final and greatest blow to the invaders, they had again crippled the souls of their enemies in accordance with their own beliefs, wanting to erase them from both this world and the next. Custer was forced to personally experience, word for word, with his own blood and life, the exact same fate of that mutilated officer whom he had ignored as a hero for years and narrated as a mere footnote of his own arrogance. Major Joel Elliott's story, therefore, cannot be read merely as the tragic end of an ambitious soldier. That unbelievable violence he and his men suffered on the freezing snow at Washita was the most naked proof of what a cruel, unforgiving geography the American frontiers were. Those 18 bodies were not just an explosion of anger from the Native Americans, they were the desperate cry of a people whose lands, pasts, and futures were stolen. But this cry, instead of creating empathy, birthed savagery. Instead of being a warning, it became the greatest excuse for total annihilation. In the dark corridors of human nature, this story, where arrogance, betrayal, and revenge intertwine, stands even today as one of the most disturbing pages of American history. Elliott was not merely killed, an example was made of him, and the bloody shadow of that example was massive enough to swallow an entire cavalry regiment even years later. All that was left behind was the meaningless, cold, and eternal silence of war.